The maple leaves had already fallen thick on the path as Charlotte Brown stepped out from the door of the house that had once been her entire world, carrying with her not just the pain, but also a new spark of belief that had just been lit. Her story was not one of a woman who crumbled before betrayal, but rather a triumphant anthem of someone who was pushed away from familiar arms, only to realize the greatest strength does not come from false kinship, but from the brave heart within herself. Every breath Charlotte took now was no longer bound by scornful eyes or deceitful words, but was the rebirth of a soul that refused to bow down. And this is her journey, a journey that not only exposes the truth, but also rewrites the definition of freedom and pride. Let me take you into that world where Charlotte Brown dared to stand up and turned her wounds into the strongest weapons to reclaim her life. The soft yellow light glowed on the old wooden walls of the Brown house as Charlotte stepped across the threshold, her hands trembling, not just from the cold outside, but from the ominous sense of dread creeping into her chest. The pumpkin pie she carried still held a trace of warmth, the sweet taste of Thanksgiving lingering in the air, but there was nothing warm in the eyes of those waiting for her in the living room. The long oak table was covered in an elaborate embroidered cloth. The traditional dishes neatly arranged, the scent of roast turkey hanging in the air. Everything looked like the perfect family portrait she had always longed to be a part of again. But tonight, as she set down the pie she had baked with her own hands, she realized that the gazes turned towards her held no trace of familial warmth. Her father, Richard Brown, sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping lightly on the wood in rhythm, his eyes cold, his lips pressed into a tight line as if waiting for a confession he was certain she could not deny. Beside him, her mother Laura kept her head down, her fingers nervously playing with the string of white pearls around her neck, as if each pearl could somehow save her from the shame that was creeping into every corner of the room. Emily, Charlotte's sister, didn't look at her either, her blonde hair falling to cover half her face, but the brief glance she cast was enough to let Charlotte know that everything had been decided long before she had crossed the threshold. The air in the cramped room she had once called a safe haven now felt stifling, as if every sound, every breath was being smothered by an atmosphere thick with suspicion. Charlotte stood there, her brown leather shoes pressed into the faded red carpet, her fingers gripping the pie as if letting go of it would shatter the last fragments of trust she still had. She hadn't even set it down when her father's voice cut through the room, slow and sharp as a blade. Charlotte, return the 50 yards learned from your mother's account. If you don't ever come back to this house. The accusation dropped like a hammer blow to Charlotte's chest. She blinked, her breath caught, and in that moment the room seemed to tilt, the usual laughter and warm wishes of Thanksgiving fading into the echoes of a time long past. She looked around the table, searching for a denial, or at least a flicker of doubt in her mother's eyes, but there was only silence. Emily, with her napkin draped idly across her lap, glanced at her as if everything was already finished, as if this was just the final move in a game she had lost long ago. Thomas, Emily's husband, took a sip of red wine, his gaze drifting past her, as smooth and untroubled as ever. She heard the clink of dishes, the faint rattle of the crystal chandelier in the draught from the window, but her own voice seemed lost to her. When she opened her mouth, the words broke apart like frozen breath. "Dad, what are you saying?" Her voice was hoarse, not the steady tone she had intended, but a trembling whisper. Richard looked up, his gaze icy and his voice without a trace of mercy. "Stop pretending. We all know you're the only one with access to your mother's account. You've betrayed the trust of this entire family." Charlotte froze. The word betrayal cut into her like a blade, slicing deep into memories of when she was just a little girl, perched on a kitchen stool listening to her mother teaching her the family's special pumpkin pie recipe for Thanksgiving. Now that same pie still warm in her hands, the warmth of family had long since died out. She turned to her mother, searching for even a shred of sympathy, but Laura just pressed her lips together, her eyes fixed on the carpet beneath her feet. The room felt like it was closing in the family atmosphere once something she had trusted more than anything had become a cold prison where she was being sentenced by the people she had once loved most. Charlotte knew she could try to explain, could try to make them see, but would anyone be willing to listen? Or had they already decided to make her the villain to cover up their own secrets? In that fleeting moment, she realized the Thanksgiving dinner she had looked forward to all year, thinking it would be a time to reunite, was actually nothing more than a family tribunal, a place where she was not allowed to defend herself. And as she set the pie down, the last warmth of it seeping into her palms, Charlotte knew she had lost everything, at least, everything she thought she belonged to in this family. Taking one last look around, she drew in a deep breath, ready to walk away from the place she had once called home. In her eyes, the family portraits on the walls were no longer happy memories, but a stark reminder that sometimes family can be the greatest betrayer of all. When Charlotte left the brown house that night, the thick mist of the Boston suburbs hung like a heavy veil that obscured the way forward, but it couldn't dim the pain throbbing relentlessly in her chest. She walked on in silence without a tear or a sob, only the crunch of her shoes on the cold, wet stone path. The pumpkin pie, the gift she had poured her heart into now, was only a memory forgotten on the family dining table. And with every step, Charlotte realized that the pie wasn't the only thing left behind tonight. She knew she would never again find the warm look in her mother's eyes, the pride of her father, or the intimate smile of her sister. All of it had vanished, leaving behind a cold emptiness that no Thanksgiving dinner fire could ever warm. Her old car was parked not far away, the yellowish glow of the street lamps casting long shadows across the dull silver paint, adding to the exhaustion of the night. As Charlotte slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the shock reverberating in her chest. The streets leading away from the quiet neighborhood looked the same as they had for years. Bare trees, stone steps, covered with dry leaves, and silent houses without a single light. But she knew that tonight, everything had changed forever. The road that once brought her home was now only an escape route, and that house was no longer a refuge. Charlotte drove aimlessly for a long while, letting the low, melancholic jazz on the radio fill the silence. Memories from childhood flickered faintly through her dry tears. Christmas mornings when she and Emily would unwrap gifts together, summer evenings when the whole family gathered on the porch to listen to the cicadas, or those nights she and her mother stayed up late baking in the small kitchen. Now, all those images felt distant and bitter because of a single baseless accusation that had collapsed everything she once believed in like a sandcastle meeting a fierce wave. She found an old roadside motel, the flickering neon sign outside flashing like her own racing heartbeat. Room number 17, small walls yellowed and the smell of dampness creeping in. Charlotte leaned against the door. Once it was shut, her heart so empty, there were no more tears left to cry. She switched on the desk lamp and sat on the bed, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. Outside the window, the fine mist of rain quietly tapped on the glass like a whispered promise of loneliness. Charlotte took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage to keep herself from collapsing, but the anger and unfamiliar emotion she rarely showed began to rise within her. She searched for her laptop in her bag, her fingers trembling as she powered up the faintly glowing screen. The pale blue light cast her haggard face in stark relief, the reflection of a woman fighting not just to prove her innocence, but to hold on to the last shred of her dignity. Charlotte reopened her old work files, the meticulously organized spreadsheets, the audit reports she had devoted her career to perfecting, and reminded herself, I am not a thief. I am the one who saved big companies from bankruptcy, the one who always upheld the highest standards and honesty. Yet Richard Brown's voice, cold and merciless, still echoed in her mind, betrayal. Just one word, but enough to make this night an endless nightmare. As dawn began to glimmer on the Boston skyline, Charlotte knew she couldn't wait for forgiveness or explanations from her family. Her mother's silence, her father's cold stare, and Emily's faint smile, all of them made it clear they would never believe her. But that didn't mean she would give up. Inside Charlotte, a thought had already begun to take root: if they could trample her trust without a second's hesitation, then she would stand up and reclaim her honor, even if it meant confronting those who once meant everything to her. Before going to sleep, Charlotte looked into the motel bathroom mirror, her hair disheveled, her deep eyes shining with a fierce light. She told herself, "They can drive me from home, but no one can take away the truth." And that night she made a silent vow she would not let this betrayal be the final chapter of her life story. The doubt that had been planted in her heart was no longer a wound, but would become the fire that lit the path she was about to walk, a path toward justice, even if the traitor's name was family. At dawn the next morning, as the weak rays of light slipped through the thick gray clouds over Boston, Charlotte awoke with a cold determination she had never felt before. The dim light in the motel room felt like a metaphor for her own state of mind, a faint flickering glow in a night of betrayal. Charlotte made a cup of strong black coffee, its bitter taste seeping between her teeth like a reminder that the sweetness family once promised was just an illusion. She sat down in front of her old laptop, the only tool that could help her shed light on the shadows in her family's story. Her eyes, still red from last night's disappointment and anger, now shone with a cold, unwavering resolve. With the same hands that once deftly pored over the most complex balance sheets in the finance industry, Charlotte began her journey not to clear her name before their judgment, but to reclaim the truth and the dignity that had been trampled upon. She opened her email and composed a message to Sarah, her close colleague at Grant & Whitmore Financial, where she had devoted the best years of her youth. Sarah was the only person Charlotte trusted, now a friend, a witness to her talent and her meticulous devotion to every number, every small detail. "Sarah, I need you to help me check the recent transactions from my mother's bank account at Franklin Mutual. I know you're working with the compliance team. I'm sure you can find what I need." She hit send and exhaled softly. Her breath fogged the screen, evoking the image of last night when her warm breath had become the breath of the rejected. Charlotte stood up and drew aside the old curtains to look outside. The early morning delivery trucks were still going back and forth along the road, busy and hurried, a rhythm of life so alien to the chaos raging inside her. When her phone rang, the screen flashing a message from Sarah, Charlotte opened it immediately. "Got it, Char. I found the transactions in the bank data, and you need to see this right away." She clicked the message open, her heart pounding as she saw the attached file filled with dense rows of data, the very evidence her family had chosen to ignore. Charlotte's eyes scanned the bank statement quickly. 3 large withdrawals each, nearly $20,000, totaling $50,000 that they had accused her of stealing. But what stunned her even more was the line that read, "Withdrawal. In person." Not an online transaction like they had accused her of. 3 times the money had been withdrawn directly at the Franklin Mutual Bank branch. Her breath grew heavy, her heart pounding in a frantic rhythm. She quickly scrolled down to the camera footage available column that Sarah had highlighted. A link led directly to the security camera footage. Undeniable evidence. Charlotte clicked on the link, her hand shaking as the frame appeared. The first image, a young woman with blonde hair pulled up high, wearing a gray hoodie, her face obscured behind oversized sunglasses. Charlotte recognized instantly the slender figure and the way Emily always fidgeted with her sleeves whenever she was nervous. Emily, her sister, who had sat silently last night without saying a word. In the video, Emily was leaning forward to sign her name, her eyes darting nervously around. Charlotte could read the worry in every gesture, but there was no regret, only calculation and the fear of being caught. Charlotte moved on to the second video. The image of David, Emily's husband, appeared. Unlike Emily, David looked calm and confident. He signed the paperwork as if it were just another routine transaction, then laughed and joked with the bank teller. His cold composure made Charlotte shudder. The brother-in-law who had once shaken her hand warmly at family gatherings was now an accomplice. She swallowed hard, the bitterness of the coffee mingling with the bitterness of the truth. Charlotte sat there quietly gathering everything. Each video, each signature compared with the withdrawal slips, she saved them all as pieces of the puzzle her family had tried so hard to hide. She understood what had happened. They had waited for the moment she helped her mother set up the online account, then used it as the perfect shield to frame her. A crime wearing the mask of family carried out by those she had once loved without a shred of doubt. When everything was clear, Charlotte shut her laptop, letting the room fall into silence. A silence no longer filled with helplessness, but with determination. She looked at herself in the mirror, a woman no longer afraid, no longer believing in the sweet facade of family. Last night they had cast her out of the home she had once thought of as her refuge. Today she would reclaim justice, not just to prove her own innocence, but to defend the belief that the truth, no matter how deeply buried under layers of lies, always had a power of its own. The next afternoon, Charlotte returned to the Brown house without warning, without a single message or phone call. She stopped the car in front of the iron gate, now faded with time, taking a deep breath to quell the storm raging in her chest. The sky over Boston was shrouded in a thick gray cloud, and the wind tossed the last few dry leaves along the road as if everything was waiting in silence for the inevitable explosion. Charlotte's steps were resolute, each beat of her heels on the porch, a steady rhythm of a heart that no longer trembled. She was no longer the woman thrown out on Thanksgiving night, but someone returning with the truth in hand, with nothing left to lose but the pain that had gnawed at her for years. The door opened, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The familiar living room was still intact, with its dark red rug and old fireplace, but the air had changed no longer. Warm with family, but heavy with tension, pressing into the fingers, clutching the chair's armrest. Richard looked up, his gaze sharp as a blade. Laura quickly glanced at Emily before lowering her eyes to her palms, avoiding her daughter's stare. Emily sat in the leather chair, her face calm, but her hands twisted in the hem of her dress, while David merely gave a cold, thin smile as if watching a play, whose ending he had known all along. Charlotte stood there, her gray-blue eyes lit with a light no one could extinguish. She placed the thick file folder on the mahogany table, her voice soft but firm enough to pierce through the walls of lies that had been built around her. "I'm here to set the truth straight," she said, each word precise like the sound of a gavel striking in a courtroom. 3 withdrawals in person at Franklin Mutual Bank, not online. Here is the video from the security camera. Here are the signatures. And here, she flipped to the final page, pointing at the enlarged photo, is the face of my sister Emily and my brother-in-law David. Not me. The sound of paper turning echoed in the room, so quiet it was almost chilling. Emily went pale, her lips moving as if to offer an excuse, then snapping shut. David, still with his faint smile, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, like he was savoring the tragic play he only saw as amusement. And Richard, the man she had once believed would protect her from the world, merely furrowed his brow, saying nothing. His silence was as heavy as stone pressing on Charlotte's chest, but no longer crushing her, because she now understood silence was not the mark of innocence but complicity. "Charlotte." Laura's voice trembled, hoarse like someone lost in a storm. "What are you doing? This is your family." Charlotte turned to her mother, her gaze calm to the point of cruelty. "Mother, family isn't a place where people trample on each other and still expect to be called one family. I have loved and I have sacrificed, but love cannot be the shield to hide betrayal." Each word fell like a drop of cold ice, carving deep into the air, thick with lies. Emily abruptly stood up, eyes pleading like a child caught stealing. "Sister, I didn't mean to. I just—" But Charlotte raised her hand, cutting off any justification. "Don't. I don't need to hear any more of your lies." Her eyes flickered over to David, still silent, his smile a thin, icy slash, and for the first time Charlotte realized he had never been part of this family. He was just an opportunist, and Emily, in her desperate hunger for affection, had become his accomplice. In that moment, Charlotte no longer felt pain. A strange peace settled over her chest as if she had shrugged off the heavy cloak of years of silent endurance. She closed the file folder and pushed it toward Richard. "I don't need you to admit I'm innocent. Because the truth doesn't need believers. The truth only needs to be spoken." She looked up at him, her eyes still like two shards of blue ice, clear and indifferent. "Decide what you're going to do next. As for me, I'm leaving this house, taking with me the one thing none of you can steal, myself." Charlotte turned her back and walked out the door, leaving behind stunned faces, fingers clenched on the chairs as if they could hold on to a truth that had just been laid bare. When the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoed down the old wooden hallway like the final farewell of a chapter that had closed. Charlotte walked down the steps, the cold wind stinging her face, but inside she carried a single precious warmth, the belief in herself, and the freedom she had reclaimed. No one could ever take that away. As Charlotte stepped across the threshold of the brown house, the evening shadows stretched long across the stone path leading to the street. The December wind carried the last dry leaves of the season rustling beneath her heels, like the quiet applause of an audience at the end of a performance. But this performance needed no thanks or applause. It was simply the end of a tragedy that had dragged on for too long, and Charlotte was the only one brave enough to step off the stage. She turned back to look at the solid oak door now closed behind her, a place that had once been a home where once echoed childhood laughter and her mother's lullabies, but now was only a thick wall of betrayal. She knew, even though they had fallen silent, every word, every glance in that room had said everything they didn't need her. And she no longer wanted to belong there. Her car waited quietly at the curb like a loyal friend. She opened the door and stepped into the familiar space. No scent of Thanksgiving candles, no clink of cutlery, or sound of glasses raised in a toast. Only the gentle silence that was hers alone. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as Charlotte took a deep breath, letting the scent of worn leather seats and the cold air outside blend together, washing away the lingering bitterness on her tongue. In the rearview mirror, she saw her own face, pale but resolute, tired but no longer afraid. Tonight, she would no longer look back. She no longer waited for apologies from Richard, no longer needed to hear Laura's tears or Emily's weak excuses. They could keep their empty promises, and the love that existed only in memory, she would keep herself. As the car began to move, Charlotte felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. She did not cry, did not waste tears on those who were no longer her family. Instead, she felt a strange tranquility, a kind of freedom she had perhaps never tasted until now. The city of Boston stretched out before her, its stone-paved streets and red brick buildings glowing under the setting sun as if welcoming her back. She didn't know where she would go tonight or what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing: from now on, she would live for herself. On the way back to her small apartment in Beacon Hill, Charlotte stopped at a roadside cafe. Warm yellow light spilled from the window, an inviting space bustling with the laughter of strangers, people who knew nothing of her family, of the past Thanksgiving night, or of the wound still aching in her chest. She stepped inside, ordered a strong espresso, and sat at a table by the window. The heat from the cup spread into her hands, a real warmth, so different from the false comfort she had clung to for so long. Charlotte looked out at the stream of people passing by outside, wondering how many of them carried in their hearts the story of a dead family, a home that had become a shelter of lies and selfishness. But then she smiled, a fleeting but powerful smile, because she understood no matter how many lies surrounded her, the truth would always be there. No matter how many nights she had cried in silence, the dawn would still come, bringing the chance to begin again. She took out her phone, opened the messaging app, and typed a short line to Sarah, the only person she trusted now. "Thank you. I won't let the truth be buried. And I won't let them steal my faith ever again." The message was sent, and Charlotte set the phone down, exhaling a long breath. Before her, the coffee still steamed, the strangers still laughed and talked, and life went on. She knew there would be more difficult days ahead, nights even longer than that Thanksgiving night. But she also knew from this moment on she had found the most important thing herself, a woman strong, free, and never again compromising with those who wanted to imprison her in the name of false family. And with that determination, Charlotte took a sip of her coffee, her eyes shining like a small flame ready to burn away any darkness waiting ahead. The next morning, as the sun shone through the window of Charlotte's small apartment in Beacon Hill, a new feeling crept into her heart. No longer the bitterness of Thanksgiving night, no longer the stealthy stab of betrayal, but a subtle light glimmering like embers on the verge of igniting. She brewed a cup of hot green tea, its gentle aroma wafting through the simple kitchen, a scent that reminded her of peaceful days before everything fell apart. Standing at the window, Charlotte looked out at the red brick rooftops and the ancient cobblestone streets, telling herself that even if her family had turned away, she still had an entire world to begin anew, a world where she didn't need permission or forgiveness to exist. Holding the teacup in her hand, Charlotte opened her laptop and began sketching the first ideas for the community project she had been nurturing all this time, a small but meaningful platform where she would share the financial skills and care that had built her reputation. She thought of the elderly, those often exploited like her mother, and knew that this would be her way to turn pain into action, an action to prove that wounds can become the foundation for something better. In Charlotte's eyes, the image of the brown house had disappeared, replaced by the vision of a community, one where no one was rejected or deceived under the guise of false family ties. In the mornings that followed, Charlotte woke up early, working tirelessly. She called nonprofit organizations, met with former colleagues, people who had once known her as a financial expert, who never compromised with wrongdoing. They listened, they nodded, and together with her, they lit a small flame of hope for those without a voice. Each email sent, each promise received, was like a small brick, rebuilding the trust she had lost that night. She was cast out of her home. One afternoon, as Charlotte walked along the Charles River, the winter wind whipped through her hair, carrying away the last of her lingering worries. She looked up at the water, shimmering with the sunset, seeing herself in it. No longer the girl who had been rejected, but a brave woman who had stood up to demand what was right. She thought of Richard, Laura, Emily, and wondered whether they felt any regret. But then she shook her head. That question no longer mattered. They could keep their lies while she had found something more precious, the peace of knowing the path she was on was truly hers. That evening, Charlotte returned to her apartment, looking at the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her eyes reflected her own image, a woman not perfect, but genuine. She knew the wound would still ache when she remembered, but she also knew that no one, no accusation could ever touch the core of who she was again. Because she had survived it all. She smiled a gentle and proud smile, because sometimes the sweetest revenge is not making them regret, but proving that she never needed them to be the strongest person she could be. Charlotte sat down at her desk, typing the first words of her plan. Outside, Boston's lights were twinkling, the tall buildings shimmering like dreams waiting to be written. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be doubts. There would be challenges, but she was ready. She had walked alone through the storm of betrayal, and now she was no longer afraid of anything. In Charlotte's heart, there was only one unwavering belief that sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the ashes, and her life in this very moment was truly beginning. And so Charlotte Brown closed the chapter of deceit and opened a new path more brilliant than ever, a path where she needed no one's approval, only herself, and her steadfast faith in justice. Her journey reminds us that even when life pushes us into the dark, we can still find the light within our own hearts. Let me share this inspiring story with you, like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories to come. Stories of courage, of standing up, and of hope that never dies. Because sometimes it's the harshest turns that lead us to where we truly belong.